Hey guys, and welcome to another one of our audio-only podcast episodes at Ghost Countries. So this is where we dive into deeper detail on one of the countries or subjects covered in a regular video, and today we're going to be looking into the Taiping Kingdom of Heavenly Peace. So yeah, and as usual, I'm not alone in this. I'll be joined by my co-host Manuel.
Hey guys, welcome back to our episode. I I personally was very interested in this episode that we had about the typing Heavenly Kingdom of Great Peace.
Hmm.
So yeah, I hope you guys liked it too, and I hope we can do a great episode here.
Yeah, no, I agree. It was a very interesting subject, and probably we should start out with a little bit of a recap here. But so the Taiping Rebellion began sometime in the 1850s and went to 1864. Ultimately, it ended with the Battle of Shanghai and the collapse of the Taiping Rebellion and Heavenly Kingdom. And this was a very I feel like I said this a lot, but it was a very interesting, tumultuous period of Chinese history. This was a major upset. You had the Qing Dynasty, which was seen as weak and corrupt and in many ways was falling apart at that period of time. You had massive casualties, somewhere between 20 to 30 million, although I've seen uh, numbers that are much higher from the rebellion itself. Now, again, this wasn't all because of actual warfare, though it was quite horrific, the total warfare you were seeing, both by the Qing and the Taiping rebels. But a lot of this occurred because of famine and plague and a whole bunch of other circumstances stemming from the rebellion itself. And then, of
Like
course, you also
no
had,
mercy.
no, exactly. And then, of course, you also had other rebellions going on at the same time. But, sorry, what were you saying, Manuel?
I mean, like there was even like no mercy among the
Mm,
opponents. Like in normal warfare times, you got like battles and then you take prisoners. But here, mostly they were not taken as prisoners, but immediately executed. And when a new city was conquered, yeah, there was a big bloodbath.
oh, no, exactly. And as I said, this went both ways. The Taiping rebels, especially if they were capturing Manchu people, it was pretty much a death sentence. There was no quarter, you were executed. And in response to that, you began to see the Qing doing the same thing with Taiping rebels, and particularly those of the Hakka group. So this was total warfare in a literal sense. And like I said, during the roughly 15 years the rebellion was ongoing, 20 to 30 million civilians and soldiers died. And some estimates put this number much, much higher, as I think the largest I've seen was actually 70 million. And it's kind of impossible to know because so many of the people who died, unfortunately, were just peasants and civilians that were, just a number at the time for a lot of people. And this was really a something of a wake-up call, I think, to the Qing dynasty and a watershed moment because they did come out of it, but they came out of it maybe not so much in a good position because the Boxer Rebellion was to come in due time.
Yeah, that's true. And I mean, like about the Taiping Rebellion, there are actually so many interesting factors. I mean, let's say it actually how it actually is in Chinese rebellions. The death toll is always incredible.
Sure.
Um, that's as well because there. I mean, food shortages in China were for hundreds of years
Hmm.
so pretty normal. And of course, like in war times or civil war times, that intensifies. And that's as well a reason for the big death toll, which was there. Um, but yeah, like I think just the fact that we have actually like a Christian
Hmm.
kingdom within the borders of China is actually already very interesting. And like there was actually even little side stories of this rebellion which were very interesting, like a little game which was invented there. um I think you told me this story the other day when we were talking. There was like that Chinese game that was invented at the Battle of Tianjin.
Oh, you're talking about Mahjong?
Yeah, yeah, I think it was Maja.
Yeah, no, the story as I have heard it so far, is that mahjong was probably invented by either bored Taiping or Qing soldiers during the siege you mentioned, and that's just kind of a little bit of a strange little historical side note from this horrific rebellion inside China during that period of time. And
Yeah,
I,
yeah,
I
like these, but these side stories are very interesting, I
oh
think.
no, exactly. And actually, on that note, as a side story, I'm glad you mentioned how there was that Christian fundamentalist component to the rebellion. But what is interesting to me was even though that was definitely legitimate, there were true believers uh, of Hong Shouchan and the theology ideology that he was pushing. But it also went beyond that. You had an ethnic dimension, you had a socioeconomic dimension, you had, I guess you could even argue, a kind of radical change component here, where you were seeing gender roles being changed, because you saw females in the military and certain positions of power at the time with the Taiping rebels. So this was truly a revolutionary group in the sense that they were seeking to do broad, a complete sweep of society at the time. It wasn't just minor instrumental change. No, this was French Revolution style, wiping everything out and starting from a new base, whether that be cultural, socioeconomic, political, theological. This was a true revolutionary movement. But what I was going to say was interesting to me is how you had other rebellions occurring more or less at the same time. My pronunciation might be off here. I'm trying my best with this, but you had the Neon Rebellion from roughly 1853 to 68. You had several Chinese Muslim rebellions, such as the Panthay Rebellion in the southwest, and the Dugan Revolt in the northwest. And also, more or less during this period of time, you had the Red Turban Rebellion from 1854 to 1856. And what's another component, and I was going to say, is it kind of speaks to I guess you could say, a practicality of the rebels at the time, was though the Taiping Rebellion ostensibly was this fundamentalist Christian movement, you had plenty of rebels from these other rebellions and Taiping rebels kind of like moving between different rebellions as the situation changed. There was a fluidity to the movement and to the rebels, and I think this all just speaks to a more broad discontent with the Qing dynasty. And of course, there were these issues that each rebellion and group had, but there was an overarching sort of catch-all, which is we don't like the Qing, and we're going to, fight against them. We want them gone, basically.
Yeah, and actually, what that whole rebellion reminds me of,
Hmm.
it is the peasants' wars in central Germany
Oh, that's interesting.
at the beginning of the 16th century.
Mm-hmm.
Because I mean, we had the Reformation. I think it's called Reformation, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that was beginning some years earlier. So like in 1517, there was that famous stuff with Luther.
Mm-hmm.
But even beforehand, you already had discontent and everything. And following that, later there were coming the peasant wars, and there was one figure which was actually pretty important, and his name was Münzer, and that was actually a social movement, like, because they wanted to have real reforms, but it was actually as well coming in the name of religion, their
Mm-hmm.
new religion, what they had. And it's interesting because it was basically the start of a new religion as well, because we had basically Catholics before, and then
Mm-hmm.
after that there was that Reformation, and there was so large discontent about the social situation there that the rebellion was actually starting off as a religious movement as well. But there were always these social reforms that they actually wanted to, because I was writing my bachelor thesis about this,
Mm-hmm.
and it is very interesting. It reminds me very much of the Taiping Rebellion.
Yeah, no, that is a really interesting aspect. And I never thought about that connection before, but yeah, I can definitely see it. And it is, I feel like I keep saying interesting, but when you look at these rebellions, how you do have, again, the trappings of a religious movement, it's kind of like an external shell. But as you dig deeper into it, there's a lot more beyond just the theological component. As you were mentioning over in Europe, and I think it's somewhat obvious with the Taiping rebels, it wasn't just religion. Of course, that was a major component, but you also, again, had the socioeconomic, ethnic, just a whole host of other factors that were adding fuel to the fire for not just the Taiping rebels, but many of these other concurrent rebellions as well.
Yeah, like I definitely do think so. It's this whole period is definitely so interesting. And actually, of course, we can make a lot of connections here as well to different areas, different times.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think anyway that this is something special, especially here as well, because we had that one strong leader, which was actually leading the whole rebellion. I mean, for example, this stuff is totally different in the Peasants' Wars, because there you had Luther, you had Münzer, you had Melanchthon, you had many different smaller leaders, and here basically you had Hong Xiuquan,
Mm-hmm.
and that's it. I mean, you had like some people who were his ministers and stuff,
True.
but in general, it was him.
True. True. And actually, I'm kind of glad you mentioned Hong Xiuquan because, okay, so as we explained in our episode, the rebellion failed and the Heavenly Kingdom was destroyed. But,
Surprising.
yeah, but even though Hong Xiuquan, he either died through accidentally eating wild edibles that may have been poisonous, or there's rumors he committed suicide, maybe he was assassinated. There's a bit of a mystery over his death. But when he did die, and you had this minor late stage transition of power, you had his the last king of the kingdom, his son, put on the throne. Sometimes he's referred to as the junior king of heaven. But again, the rebellion was falling apart at this moment. The capital was under siege and was taken very shortly thereafter. And his son was eventually captured by the Qing dynasty. And this is not something we included in the episode, but I just thought it would be of note here. He was, despite his young age, and despite really, he was 14 at the time, and not having a whole lot to do with the rebellion itself, he was still seen as a figurehead, and, obviously being the son of Hong Xiuquan, he was sentenced to death by what is known as the lingering death, or slow slicing, death by 1,000 cuts. I believe the name in Mandarin is Lingqi. So, yeah, it was a pretty gruesome and horrific end to the last figurehead, so to speak, of the Taiping Rebellion. But then again, even Hong Xiuquan, his body was dug up, cremated, and shot out of a cannon. So they were doing their best to erase all figureheads and icons of the Taiping Rebellion. The Qing dynasty was out to wipe this off, and it wasn't just these individuals. As we mentioned in the episode, there was widespread persecution of the Hakka and others at the time. Even though the rebellion ended, the violence and turmoil didn't end.
So do you want to go a bit more into detail what the death of 1,000 cuts is?
Sure, I mean, if you have more info you want to provide.
No, like the death of 1,000 cuts, if I remember it correctly, is basically they are cutting off parts of your body piece by piece while you are still alive. And by that, I don't mean they cut off your leg, but like first some parts of your leg and stuff like that, until you finally die.
Oh, no,
like
exactly.
Finger or parts of your finger and stuff. It's horrible. It's gruesome.
Oh, exactly. And it's very similar to, you could think over in the European situation, you had, being drawn and quartered. It is an execution, yes, but it is more a public display meant to intimidate and showcase what would happen if you supported or acted like these people, and to not only just humiliate and destroy, but, just destroy in the complete sense any of the figureheads or people associated with a particular group or movement. It has symbolism behind it. It's meant to destroy that group.
Yeah,
and obviously the person.
it aims to, yeah, set a set an example
Exactly.
for the people. And actually, it reminds me. I mean, that's not what you said about Hong Qiuqian and his rests, which were shot into the air by a cannon.
Mm-hmm.
That reminds me a little of that little story from Three Kingdoms,
Mm.
a basic Chinese, a famous Chinese novel. Um, okay, so this is like we're talking about a period here, 300 um, after Christ, and they had that one leader who was called Dong Zhuo, and he was, yeah, basically an usurper to power. And at the end, there was like a little, uh, let's say, assassination plot, and he was killed. And they were letting, I mean, they were trampling over his dead body,
Mm-hmm.
letting it lay in the street, let it be eaten by dogs, and yeah, he was just left there for a very long period of time.
Mm-hmm.
And then after that, there was even another horrible story that I don't totally remember here. But that's like one another example in Chinese history where it, they just did like so horrible things with the dead body of as well of the person
Mm-hmm.
to show the others that they shouldn't follow suit.
Mm-hmm. Well, similar vein, I mean, we can look into more and more examples, but I mean, Oliver Cromwell over in, the United Kingdom or Britain, I mean, even after his death, he was dug up and there was the posthumous execution where his body was mutilated and beheaded. So this is something that occurred throughout history and many different countries and cultures. It was
Yeah,
again, something meant to humiliate, discredit, and destroy, both in a figurative and literal sense, the individual, the movement, the group they were associated with, um, and to obviously scare and intimidate those who may have been supportive of the group to not continue their association going forward, lest they have a similar fate.
yeah, yeah. So that's totally correct. I mean, we got all these kind of situations everywhere, wherever this happens, because yeah, let's say the thought behind that is everywhere the same, I'd say.
Hmm.
um yeah, so let's get on with the rebellions. So can you explain us the what was Black Flag? What was it?
Okay, so yeah, this is something we kind of found out as we were doing research on the Heavenly Kingdom and the Taiping Rebellion. But after the rebellion ended and the capital was taken and the rebels were more or less defeated in China, you did have some remnants associated with the Taiping rebels. It's a little unclear about what their connection was, but you did have people who more than likely had some association with the Taiping Rebellion make their way down south into Vietnam, and they eventually formed what became known as the Black Flag Army. So these were kind of a splinter remnant of bandit groups with various ethnic backgrounds that, as I said, came over from Guangxi into Vietnam, maybe in the 1865, and they played a pretty instrumental role in history down there. The things that stick out to me were their role in kind of harassing the French, which led to the Sino-French War of 1884 to 1885. Now, they didn't succeed here and they were defeated and eventually disbanded, but they would pop up again later in history in 1895 in response to the Japanese invasion of Taiwan. And it's pretty interesting just to see how even though the rebellion ended in China, you had, these splinter groups, these remnants moving out and playing rather significant roles in the histories and events of other countries in the area. And you can look at this in a similar way to what's occurred in Iraq with, how you had the pop up of the Islamic State, and you had this group spill over into Syria, and you had a lot of fallout from events that ostensibly are connected to one country, but obviously they're not. Borders can be porous, and I think this kind of demonstrates that.
Yeah, That's true. And actually, I think like maybe that Vietnam stuff. There's maybe something like which, I mean, that they were even present in Vietnam. Like I think that's definitely something which maybe one day we can as well cover, at least in parts, because it's actually very interesting. Like
Hmm.
especially for me, I must admit that with many of these, I mean, in this area, many of those countries, I have a very yeah little knowledge about how they're what was the situation at that time.
Hmm.
So that makes it for me even more interesting to actually think about the effects of these small groups which go to other countries and go on doing rebellions there or getting into other countries' affairs.
Oh, definitely.
It makes it very interesting, and yeah, it's basically the splintering when you uh, basically cut off the central organ, then like many little pieces go out everywhere, and that's exactly what happened here. And I think it's very very fascinating to imagine that if we have any listeners here who knows anything about that, like for example, a Vietnamese who knows these kind of stories in from Vietnam's perspective, you can leave it down in the comments. It would be very interesting for me.
Oh, sure, definitely,
Um,
definitely. I mean, any viewer
yeah,
interaction, we've had a lot more people suggesting countries to be covered in future videos, and both of us love that because there's countries we don't know about, and while we're doing research, we learn things like I will admit as well, I did not know much about the Black Flag Army until I began to dig into it as a result of our research on the Heavenly Kingdom and the Taiping Rebellion. So history, it's kind of like a string. You pull and you'll just find it goes off in different directions and frays and splinters, but there is a connection, and it's fascinating to look into that. So yeah, no, I definitely agree. This is something we will look into in the future. And in relation to this, like the Japanese invasion of Taiwan, the Black Flag Army, you also had the very short-lived Republic of Formosa. So there's a lot to look into, including a ghost country there.
yeah, and this could definitely be an issue.
Yeah.
Like for example, Formosa, where I think we both said it wrong in the
Yeah, I don't
same
know
way.
why we both mispronounced that.
uh, anyway, yeah, Formosa is actually very interesting too, and could be, yeah, we could consider that a ghost country.
Yeah.
One day we will see. Um, but yeah, definitely something to look into in future
And
projects.
as we did mention with these, splinterings, I do think, just as with our last podcast, we're going to go into a little bit of alternative history here and talk about how the Heavenly Kingdom potentially could have survived and maybe been viable. Now, again, this is all going to be speculation, but before we get into that, I think we should talk about more of what occurred after the rebellion was crushed, because this was not the end. I mean, in a relatively short period of time, you also had the Boxer Rebellion, and I think that was something you wanted to speak about more so.
Yeah, that's true. So the Boxer Rebellion was actually a follow up of these rebellions, and made it actually, yeah. I mean, this whole Boxer Rebellion actually changed the whole issues in China, and were actually later on leading to the downfall of the Qing dynasty. Actually, I would say argue that actually here in this time span that we were looking at from the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom, there was already like the beginning of the end of the empire
Hmm. Yeah,
But the
definitely.
Boxer Rebellion was basically, yeah, a civil war inside China against foreign influence. Because at that time we had like many European powers. But if I'm not mistaken, the US and Japan were involved too, right?
In the Boxer Rebellion, yes.
Yeah,
Even in the Taiping Rebellion, you did have American involvement. I mean, there were not just Americans, but there were Europeans and others. But you had mercenary groups that fought both for the Taiping rebels and against the Taiping rebels, and with the Qing Dynasty. There was the ever victorious army. There's a lot of very interesting individuals who were involved at that time period as kind of like soldiers of fortune, more or less.
yeah. So we had basically the Boxer Rebellion, which was, people always think like it was a war of Chinese against foreigners in China, or let's say the foreign armies which were stationed in China. Um, but that's just half of the story, because actually the troops of the emperor were involved in that too.
Hmm.
And yeah, so it was actually a huge uprise in China, and against that stuff, which actually established itself after, or actually even during the time of the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom,
Hmm.
which was, I mean, the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom was one factor why China was weakened. Not the only one, but definitely one factor,
Well,
which made it, of course, much easier for Western powers to eat up pieces of the cake, as they called it.
well, and that also brings up something kind of interesting about how the Boxer Rebellion was kind of an inversion of what you saw with the Taiping Rebellion, where you had this adoption of, a radical fundamentalist type of Christianity. And those were the rebels. Those were the groups that were pushing and trying to establish themselves within China at the time. But the Boxer Rebellion, obviously, there's a lot of components to it, but you had to push back against those who, the missionary groups and others that were seeming to penetrate and do away with the old order in China at the time. So it's just kind of interesting to me how they almost seem to be inversions of each other.
Yeah, that's true. Like, if I'm not mistaken, the Boxer Rebellion actually even started with the attack on some Christian missionaries in Beijing.
Hmm.
But I could be mistaken here. But I do have in mind something like that, and that
Well, there
yeah,
definitely
when
were attacks on missionaries and Chinese converts, and there was this perceived double standard, which did have some, obvious reality to it. But I mean that those who were associating with foreigners were getting better treatment and economic opportunities. And there was this whole socioeconomic and cultural factor, just like you saw in the Taiping Rebellion, but it also was mixed up with a theological component. Although in this time it was, like the inverse. Rather than a radical group pushing it, it was more of a reaction to a foreign presence in China.
yeah, yeah, that's definitely true. Um, so yeah, so the Boxer Rebellion, as you already mentioned, was basically a counter movement against what happened before.
Hmm.
And yeah, that leads us actually to the question. So why was there so much pushback against Christians and Western powers in China?
Hmm.
Well, the actual reason is that European powers, let's say mainly European powers, not only, were kind of colonizing China during that time. Like, it was not happening like in Africa, for example, but it was definitely like Europeans were trying to get ports
Hmm.
to trade there, and had a lot of special allowances to do whatever they want in their areas, which all started with the unequal treaties.
Hmm.
It was called unequal treaties, I think. Um, and yeah, so there was a lot of pushback to that, especially later, um, because we had, I think, 8 powers at the end who had some, yeah, some little territories in China, which were of course taken mostly against the will of the Chinese people. Um, yeah, and that all started here during the time that we actually focused on.
Hmm.
Um, I mean, the first I think was given. Oh, well, the very first was actually Macau. That was a lot of time back. But then I think it was during the first Opium War, where basically territory was granted.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, and later it went back all the way to the Boxer Rebellion. And I do think it's interesting as well that Japan had a stake here, because mostly nobody would think about this, but Japan was, yeah, as we already said in our last podcast, a rising power during that time,
Oh yeah.
as well as the US.
Yeah, no, definitely. And you also did see that, well, as you mentioned, Japan was a rising regional and potentially even international power at that period of time, but they had a major contender in the region as well, which was Russia. And you saw that dynamic, the contest between Japan and Russia, really more overt than you had at any other period in the Boxer Rebellion. Now, of course, you would eventually have other events that would demonstrate that more so. But it's interesting to see how these two powers are essentially heading for a clash, and it's being shown in the Boxer Rebellion, you know, through their various competitions at the time. No, and that actually brings up a very important question that nobody ever seems to ask. But what if Hong Xiuquan really was the son of God? I mean, you got to think about that.
Well, I think then with our episodes that we did, we have a big problem there.
No, but okay, so getting more serious for a second. So we have talked about the Taiping Rebellion, the Heavenly Kingdom, and obviously we go into more detail in our episode about the events that led to the rebellion, what occurred in the rebellion, then ultimately its end. But as I mentioned earlier, we were going to go into a little bit of alternative history here about how maybe the Heavenly Kingdom could have survived. And at least in my opinion, as we were kind of talking about before we started recording, the only way I could see the Taiping rebels succeeding and establishing, this little breakaway kingdom. First off, I want to put it up front. I don't think they could have taken over all of China. I think they could have had a regional entity in like southeast, southern China, but in terms of completely supplanting the Qing dynasty, I don't see that happening. But
Yeah,
even
I'd agree with that.
even for this to happen, though, I think two things more or less would have had to occur. Firstly, that internal purge you saw of not just the military higher ups, but also tons of Taiping soldiers that occurred in the latter days of the rebellion. I don't think that could have occurred, or at least it would have had to been minimized. It couldn't have been as widespread with the number of casualties that it had, because that absolutely devastated their fighting power. And secondly, I think foreign powers would have had to remain neutral. Maybe you could have had some support. Maybe they could have, courted the Japanese or the Americans or one of the European powers and continued to receive financial and military support.
And
Material
diplomatic.
support, yeah, and diplomatic as well. But I don't think, even if they had minimized the internal purge or not had it occur at all, I still think if you had these foreign powers throw their lot in with the Qing dynasty, the Taiping rebels ultimately would have been defeated. I think those two things would to have had to occur so that there would have been a viable heavenly kingdom in China at that time.
Yeah, I do agree with that, and I think actually, I mean, it all goes with the question as like we have a lot of like these kind of situations. I mean, we had Hong Qiuquan as the leader,
Hmm.
but what would have occurred after his death? Would have son had enough prestige
Mm.
to keep everything together? That's actually a big question mark here. Even if the whole rest would have been solved,
Hmm.
and I totally agree that they wouldn't have had control over all of China during that time. I just don't believe it because, like, yeah, he was very successful in areas where Christian influence was very strong.
Hmm.
But like when he went to areas which were not, yeah, which didn't have a big Christian support already, then he was meeting problems. And so actually, I do think that he could have been yeah, a kingdom inside China, and even be independent from China
Hmm.
with the support of countries, as you already mentioned. And I think the diplomatic support here is very important, like as to have like kind of guarantees or even maybe even allies with some of these countries because they hope to have better conditions in whatever they did.
Well, you bring
But
up. Oh, sorry.
yeah, no, continue.
No, I was just going to say you bring up a really interesting point, which was about secession. And it's like, I don't know, and I don't think any of us really can, what would have occurred had that internal purge not happened and had the Heavenly Kingdom continued. Because I think it's reasonable to assume Hong Xiuquan would have wanted some type of hereditary, dynasty to be established, but you already were seeing divisions. occurring within the rebel movement. I mean, that is in large part why this internal purge occurred. Hong Xiuquan felt threatened when various individuals were questioning not even just his theological standing, but also his, I guess you could say, political standing within the movement, his status. So there were factions, in a way, beginning to emerge, and whether these factions would have fallen upon each other no matter what, it opens up a big question, because there would have had to have been some line of secession down the line. Now, to be fair, Hung Shou-chan wasn't that old, so I think for the time being, he probably could have managed things, but you never know. I mean, if these factions were really growing as divided as it seems, even if that purge hadn't occurred, maybe a similar event would have occurred a few years later down the line. And then also in relation to the Western powers, or the foreign powers in general, I should say, I don't know how the rebels could have played the card diplomatically. I mean, on face value, it seems easy, but it obviously wasn't. And a big impetus for the foreign powers to throw their lot in with the Qing was the siege and battle of Shanghai. So, but at the same time, looking at it from a practical perspective, from the Taiping rebels' point of view, you couldn't just have Shanghai sitting there as Qing controlled. I mean, that's basically at your back, and also it's a major trade port, population center. This was something that had to be under your control and not your enemies. So, I mean, as I think about this, maybe there could have been some negotiated agreement where they would have allowed a much greater economic presence of foreign powers in Shanghai in return for their support of the Taiping rebels capturing it. But that would have required a lot of diplomatic finesse.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. So, uh, yeah, I mean, as we always have it, it's difficult to predict because we must here we should even consider like who is able to do certain things which would be necessary to achieve things. And yeah, since it's difficult, I don't see much potential of anybody being. I mean, people. Yeah, I mean, of course, people they get better with their tasks. You know, like the more tasks they have, the better they get. But the question is, if you would you have had somebody who is that influential and even that talented to achieve that?
Hmm.
And I just don't see it. But I mean, admittedly, maybe we just don't know enough people precisely during that time. Maybe there were.
Well, and there were definitely people within the Taiping ranks who were pushing for modernization, industrialization, the adoption of railroads, steamships, a postage system. There were definitely reformist groups, and I think if you look at the movement as a whole, there was a very it's kind of weird because, as we keep saying, you had this very fundamentalist religious component, which is pretty obvious, but at the same time, there also was this open mindedness to reform and change. So
Yeah.
I think in some ways the Taiping rebels could have done this. It just depended on their leadership, and I still stand by it. If that purge had not occurred, and if you had not had the foreign powers basically turn against them, if they had at least remained neutral, I think there is a decent likelihood they could have carved out some small kingdom in, the southeast or south of China and just held it. I
And the interesting component to it is actually like, I mean, the whole geography and politics of that region would be so different nowadays if a kingdom like this would have survived.
mhm.
I mean, that's actually so fascinating. Like, because, for example, the whole history of China would have had to be rewritten completely because the empire didn't stay together, let's say.
Mhm.
So the question is, would they have ever, um, how to call it, would they ever have reached the power again what they had one day?
Mm.
And I doubt it. And so a big factor, a big power from that time would be totally gone. I mean, not totally gone, but completely different. And that makes it interesting because then the whole story with Japan would have gone differently. The influence of the Soviet Union on China would have been differently. Everything would have changed.
Oh no,
And
exactly, exactly.
and we don't know where China would stand nowadays with something like this.
Oh, 100%. And actually, I'm glad you brought up Japan because as we were talking about this, and I was thinking about, their invasion of Formosa and their various other moves in the region. I mean, in a lot of ways, if the Heavenly Kingdom had played its cards more or less as we had, just discussed, I think it would have made a lot of sense for Japan to support them. Now, that would have been in a limited way, probably. Again, probably some trade, some diplomatic overtures, and perhaps some material support to their army. But if they had been able to do something at the time that divided China, this would have been very much advantageous for them to exert greater influence in the region, as they would eventually do in due time. So, I think you could have seen that perspective or that scenario, I should say, come into play if the Taiping rebels had A, not had the purge, B, had done things differently in terms of diplomatic action with the various foreign powers, and especially if they had tried to engage with Japan at the time. I think you could have seen something like that shape up. And who knows, other European powers, or foreign powers, I should say, might have bandwagoned on the thing. It's like, hey, Japan's getting this out of it. Why don't we, hitch on as well? Because it's advantageous for us to have a divided, weaker country at the time.
Yeah, yeah, that's definitely possible.
Eh,
Um, yeah,
No, I was just gonna say, and what that would mean, I don't know either. Because if, again, let's just say more or less the borders of the Heavenly Kingdom remained as they did, maybe a little bit of movement here or there. If that had broken off, and if Japan had more or less done the moves it had done, and the other foreign powers eventually as well, you would have had this northern-based, I guess, the Manchu Qing. I think they would have probably remained intact, but then again, would they? If they had lost such a significant chunk of their kingdom, this would be such a major, discrediting of them. Maybe they would have fallen apart and you are retreated to Manchuria, and then you have some other upstart group pop up in the other northern part of China, and who knows what would
the
have
Muslim
happened in the
regions, for example.
yeah, in the West. I'm sure if the rebellion succeeded with the Taiping rebels, you definitely would have had other rebellions occur in what is now the southwest and the far west of China. So this definitely could have been another moment of fracturing, as has occurred in its historic past.
Yeah, and let's not forget, if you have internal divisions, then you still have another kingdom to the south, which is very interested in you getting weaker, so they can grab more land, and that is Taiping Heavenly Kingdom.
Yeah,
So it's definitely very interesting what would have happened then. And
yeah.
I actually do have some doubts as well that the Qing dynasty would have survived because I mean that would have been such a big phase of loss and prestige
Hmm.
that I don't know if they would ever, yeah, I mean if they would ever get over it basically.
No, it's definitely a rabbit hole to go down because that one event would change so much, and it could lead to the Qing, like I said, just having to retreat up to Manchuria more or less because, or at least another part of China because they lost so much face, they're discredited. And if you had just another rebellion or internal divisions, like you said, the Taiping could have exploited that, and who knows, they could have expanded their borders even more. And I think you would have had chaos and splinter groups and all this other stuff, other rebellions popping up in different parts of the country. So this really could have been a massive, collapse for
Yeah,
China
but of
at that
course,
period.
yeah, but of course we got to say like this is all under the assumption that inside the Heaven Kingdom of Great Peace there is no internal
Oh,
fractionings and blah blah
exactly.
because probably there would have been as well.
Oh no, exactly. And I think, like we said, the reason that military purge happened is those factions were beginning to emerge already. So if that was already happening then, I think it's almost a guarantee it would have happened down the line, even if the purge had been put off and they had played their cards right diplomatically. There definitely would have been some internal division, and I think ultimately that's, if you want to get to the key reason the Taiping rebels were defeated, there was this inability to coordinate internally, and the purge is probably the best example of that, in my opinion at least.
Yeah, definitely. I do think so too.
So
So
yeah.
yeah, we basically arrive at the same point as we do in general in these episodes. Who knows? Is interesting. You could definitely discuss this topic for yeah probably hours and hours and hours.
Hmm.
The more you get into detail, but I think we're done for this time with our recap of the Taiping Rebellion and some old history here.
Oh yeah.
Um, I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. Uh, as I said, I do think it's very interesting. It was actually one of my favorite episodes of all those ones that we produced until right now. Um, and if you have any comments on what we said here, or if you disagree with us, write it down in the comments. Let us know.
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, if you guys have different takes, and all this is, at least the alt history part, is speculation on our behalf. So like, if you think there's another way history could have gone, if you think more or less the rebels, the Taiping rebels, never would have succeeded, let us know. Or if you think they would have succeeded and maybe internal reforms, and there was some indication stuff like that was happening. I mean, they were lessening in some of their more strict rules and regulations already as the kingdom and rebellion went on. Maybe there would have been internal reform and it wouldn't have remained this theocratic state to the extent it was. But the point I'm getting to is if you have other perspectives, we'd love to hear it. If you think history could have gone in a different path, let us know. Again, more than interested. And I guess we'll see you guys again next time. Yeah, that's it.
Okay, guys. See you next time.
Bye.